The sun burned low over the South African veldt, casting long shadows across the cracked, dusty road. Thomas, a wiry man in his late 40s, wiped sweat from his brow as he trudged along the forgotten path. His boots crunched against the gravel. The only sound in the stillness of the late afternoon. He wasn't looking for trouble, just a shortcut to the village where he'd been delivering supplies for the local clinic. But trouble found him. A rusted cage sat abandoned by the roadside, half hidden by thorny acacias. Inside, a lion lay slumped, its ribs sharp against matted fur. The beast's eyes, dull and sunken, flickered with the faintest spark as Thomas approached. He froze. This wasn't a zoo or a sanctuary. This was an illegal trap, the kind poachers used to snare animals for black market circuses or trophy hunters. The lion's mane was patchy, its body emaciated from starvation. It was barely alive. Thomas's heart pounded. He should walk away. He had no weapons, no training, just a pocket knife and a battered water canteen, but something in the lion's gaze, raw, pleading, almost human, held him there. He glanced around. No one, not a soul for miles. His hands trembled as he knelt by the cage, the metal hot under his palms. The lock was crude, but heavy, rusted from years of neglect. He worked at it with his knife, muttering to himself, "This is madness, Thomas, pure madness." The lock gave way with a groan, and the cage door creaked open. Thomas stumbled back, expecting the lion to lunge. Instead, it lifted its head, its amber eyes locking onto his. No growl, no bared teeth, just a long, unblinking stare. Thomas's breath caught. He felt seen not as prey, but as something else entirely. "You're free now," he whispered, his voice shaking. "Go on, get out of here." The lion didn't move. Not at first. Then, with agonizing slowness, it dragged itself forward, its paws scraping the cage floor. Thomas held his ground, every instinct screaming to run. The lion collapsed just outside, the cage panting heavily, its body too weak to go further. Thomas hesitated, then poured water from his canteen into a shallow dip in the ground. The lion lapped at it, its tongue rasping against the earth. He named the lion Majaro, a word he'd heard from a local elder meaning strength. It felt right. Thomas sat a safe distance away, watching as the lion's breathing steadied. He didn't know why he stayed, why he didn't just leave the animal to its fate. But in that moment, under the vast African sky, something shifted inside him. He'd spent years drifting, through jobs, through towns, through a life that felt hollow. Saving Majaro felt like the first thing he'd done that mattered. Thomas radioed a nearby wildlife sanctuary, one he'd heard of but never visited. Hours later, a battered truck arrived, carrying 2 rangers who stared in disbelief at the scene, a half-dead lion and a man sitting calmly beside it. "You're either brave or crazy," one of them said, shaking his head. They loaded Majaro onto a stretcher, and Thomas followed, unable to walk away. At the sanctuary, the rangers warned him. "Lions don't forget, but they also don't forgive. Don't expect gratitude," they said. "He's wild, not a pet." Thomas nodded, but he wasn't so sure. That look in Majaro's eyes wasn't wild. It was something deeper, something that would haunt him for years to come. Over the next few weeks, Thomas became a regular at the sanctuary, drawn back to check on Majaro, the lions. Recovery was slow but steady. Antibiotics for infections, protein-rich meals to rebuild muscle, and a spacious enclosure where he could stretch his legs. Thomas watched from behind the fence, marveling at the transformation. Majaro's mane thickened. His frame filled out and his eyes regained their fire. But it was the way the lion watched him back that stayed with Thomas. Every visit, Majaro would pad to the fence, sit and stare as if acknowledging the man who'd given him a second chance. Thomas didn't know it then, but that act of compassion, unlocking a cage under a burning sun, had set in motion a bond that would defy distance, time, and even death itself. Majaro wasn't just a lion. He was a mirror reflecting something Thomas had buried long ago: purpose. And one day that purpose would come roaring back in a way no one could have predicted. The sanctuary was a patchwork of enclosures and dusty trails, nestled in a valley where the air smelled of dry grass and eucalyptus. Thomas arrived each morning, his old pickup rattling over the uneven road. He'd taken a volunteer position, cleaning pens, hauling feed, repairing fences. Anything to stay near Majaro. The lion had become his anchor, a reason to get up when the weight of his past threatened to pull him under. Majaro's recovery was nothing short of miraculous. The skeletal creature Thomas had freed was now a towering presence. His mane, a dark cascade that caught the sunlight. He moved with a quiet power, pacing his enclosure with a grace that made the rangers whistle in awe. But it was his silence that struck Thomas. Most Majaro rarely roared, not like the other lions. Instead, he'd sit by the fence when Thomas approached, his amber eyes steady, almost contemplative. Thomas would talk to him about the weather, his old life as a mechanic, the wife he'd lost to a car accident years ago. Majaro listened, or seemed to, his head tilted slightly, his tail flicking. The other volunteers noticed it too. "That lion's ain't got a thing for you," said Sarah, a young ranger with a knack for reading animals. "Never seen anything like it." Thomas shrugged it off, but he felt it, a connection that went beyond words, beyond reason. He'd sit for hours, separated by the chain-link fence, yet closer to Majaro than he'd been to anyone in years. The lion's presence healed something in him, stitching up wounds he hadn't realized were still bleeding. But peace never lasts. 6 months into Majaro's recovery, a new figure arrived at the sanctuary. Victor Klein, a wealthy donor with a slick smile and sharper intentions. Klein funded half the sanctuary's budget, and he knew it. During a tour, he stopped at Majaro's enclosure, his eyes narrowing. "This one's a beauty," he said, tapping his cane against the fence. "Perfect for a private reserve. I know a collector in Dubai who'd pay top dollar." Thomas, sweeping nearby, froze. The head ranger David tried to steer the conversation away, but Klein was relentless. "Sanctuaries are nice, but business is business. That lion's a gold mine." Thomas's grip tightened on the broom. He'd heard stories of private reserves, glorified cages for rich men's egos. Majaro deserved better that night. Thomas couldn't sleep. He saw Majaro's eyes in the dark, felt the weight of that roadside rescue. He'd freed the lion once. He couldn't let him be caged again. The next morning he confronted David. "You're not seriously considering Klein's offer, are you?" David sighed, rubbing his temples. "We need his money, Thomas. Without it, the whole sanctuary could shut down." Thomas didn't care. He started a petition among the volunteers, rallied local support, even wrote to wildlife organizations. Klein's offer wasn't just about Majaro, it was about every animal in the sanctuary. If they sold one, what stopped them from selling more? Thomas, who'd spent years avoiding conflict, found his voice. He stood at community meetings, his hands shaking, but his words steady, telling Majaro's story. He was dying in that cage. He said, "I didn't save him, so he could end up in another one." The fight dragged on for weeks. Klein pushed harder, hinting at pulling his funding. The sanctuary's board wavered, but Thomas was relentless, driven by something he hadn't felt in years: purpose. He organized protests outside Klein's hotel, got a local journalist to write an exposé. Slowly the tide turned, public pressure mounted, and Klein backed. Off grumbling about sentimental fools, Majaro stayed. Thomas stood by the lion's enclosure the day the decision was finalized. His chest tight with relief, Majaro approached the fence, pressed his massive head against it, and let out a low rumbling. A purr. Thomas laughed, tears stinging his eyes. "You're welcome, big guy," he said. For the first time in years, he felt alive, like he'd fought for something bigger than himself. But the victory was bittersweet. Thomas didn't know it yet. But The world had a way of tearing apart even the strongest bonds. The letter arrived on a rainy morning, the kind where the sky seemed to weep for what was coming. Thomas stood in the sanctuary's office, the paper trembling in his hands. Majaro was being transferred. A legal loophole, some obscure regulation about wildlife permits, had given a distant reserve the right to claim him. The sanctuary's board, under pressure from regulators, had caved. There was nothing Thomas could do. He drove to Majaro's enclosure, the rain soaking through his jacket. The lion was pacing, sensing the tension in the air. A transport truck idled nearby, its engine growling like an intruder. Rangers in slickers moved with quiet efficiency, preparing a reinforced crate. Thomas's throat tightened. "This isn't right," he said to David, who stood nearby, avoiding his gaze. "He belongs here. Here." "It's out of our hands, Thomas," David muttered. "The reserves got better funding, better security. He'll be safe." Safe. The word felt hollow. Thomas knew what safe meant in places like that. Larger cages maybe, but still cages. He knelt by the fence, ignoring the mud soaking his knees. Majaro stopped pacing and approached, his eyes locking onto Thomas's. For a moment it was just them, the rain, a soft curtain around their world. "I'll find you again, boy," Thomas whispered, his voice breaking. "I promise." Majaro let out a low huff, his breath warm even through the fence. The rangers called out, urging Thomas to step back. He didn't. Not until they tranquilized Majaro, the lion's massive body slumping into the crate. Thomas watched as the truck rolled away, its taillights fading into the rain. He stood there long after it was gone, the ache in his chest heavier than anything he'd ever felt. Time moved on, as it always does. Thomas stayed at the sanctuary, but it wasn't the same. The other animals filled his days, but none filled the void. Majaro left. He stopped talking about the lion, stopped telling the story of the roadside rescue. It hurt too much. Months turned to years, and Thomas's health began to evolve, a cough that wouldn't quit, a tiredness that sank into his bones. He ignored it, kept working, kept moving, but the world, as always, had other plans. Majaro, far away in his new reserve, adapted in his own way. The enclosure was larger, the food and plentiful, but something was missing. He'd paced the fence at dusk, his eyes fixed on the horizon, as if searching for a figure that never came. The rangers there noticed his restlessness, but chalked it up to wild instincts. They didn't know the story, didn't know about the man who'd knelt by a cage and changed everything. Thomas's life grew quieter. He moved to a small cottage near the village, tended a garden, and kept to himself. The sanctuary felt too empty without Majaro. So he visited. Less often. The world moved on, and so did the story of the man and the lion. But Majaro didn't forget. Deep in his core, in a place no fence could touch, he carried the memory of a man who'd given him freedom. And one day, that memory would pull him back across a continent, defying every law of nature and man. The hospital room smelled of antiseptic and regret. Thomas lay in a narrow bed, the sheets crisp against his thinning frame. The ceiling tiles were stained, a map of leaks and time. He stared at them, counting the cracks, anything to avoid the weight of the doctor's words. Stage 4, lung cancer, inoperable. Months, maybe. The doctor had said, his voice soft but final. "We can make you comfortable." Comfortable. Thomas, almost, laughed. He'd never chased comfort, not since the day he'd pried open that cage. He'd chased something else, meaning maybe, or redemption. Now at 56 he was out of time to chase anything. The nurse Maria was kinder than most. She'd sit with him during her breaks, her dark eyes warm with questions she didn't ask. Thomas liked her for that. She didn't push, didn't pry, just listened when he spoke, which wasn't often. One evening, as the sun dipped below the hospital's barred windows, Thomas's voice broke the silence. "Ever heard of a lion remembering a man?" he asked, his words raspy. Maria raised an eyebrow, setting down her clipboard. "A lion?" she said, half smiling. "You pulling my leg, Mr. Thomas?" He shook, his head, his gaze distant. "His name was Majaro. I freed him years ago, found him starving in a cage by the road. You wouldn't believe the way he looked at me." Maria leaned forward, her curiosity piqued. Thomas told her the story, haltingly and first then with a quiet fire, the cage, the lock, the lion's eyes, the sanctuary, the fight to keep Majaro free. The day they took him away, Maria listened, her hands folded in her lap, her face unreadable. When he finished, she said, "That's some story. You think he'd remember you after all this time?" Thomas shrugged, wincing as pain flared in his chest. "Doesn't matter, he's out there living. That's enough." But it wasn't not really. He'd made a promise to find Majaro again, and he'd failed. The regret gnawed at him sharper than the cancer. Maria started bringing him books about lions, documentaries on her phone during night shifts. She'd play them softly, the sound of roars and rustling grass filling the room. Thomas watched, his eyes brighter than they'd been in weeks. "He's out there somewhere," he'd murmur, and Maria would nod, though she wasn't sure she believed him. Lions were wild, not loyal, but Thomas's story stuck with her, a thread pulling at something deeper. Outside the hospital, the world kept turning. News of Thomas's illness spread through the village, but no one knew the full story of the man and the lion. Not yet Maria, though, couldn't shake it. She started asking around, tracking down old sanctuary workers, piecing together fragments of Thomas's past. She found a name, Majaro, and a reserve halfway across the country. She didn't know why it mattered, but it did. Something was coming. Something bigger than hospital walls or medical charts. The past was reaching for the present, and it carried the scent of the wild. The reserve was a sprawl of golden plains dotted with acacias and the distant silhouettes of grazing antelope. Majaro, now older but no less majestic, ruled. His enclosure with a quiet dignity. His mane was fuller, streaked with grey, but his eyes still burned with that same intensity Thomas had seen years ago. The rangers called him the Watcher because of his habit of staring westward at dusk, motionless, as if waiting for something no one could name. Sifo, a young ranger with a scar across his cheek, noticed it first. Majaro wasn't like the other lions. He didn't roar for attention or pace out of boredom. His restlessness had purpose, a rhythm that matched the setting sun. "He's waiting for something," Sifo said one evening, leaning against the fence. The other rangers laughed, but Sifo didn't. He'd grown up hearing stories of animals with long memories. Elephants who mourned dogs. Who crossed continents? Why not a lion? One night, cleaning out the reserve's archives, Sifo found a faded photo tucked in a file. A man kneeling by a cage. A skeletal lion inside the man's face was weathered. His eyes kind. The file mentioned a name, Thomas, and a roadside rescue that had become legend among older rangers. Sifo read on his pulse, quickening. The dates matched. The lion in the photo was Majaro. He showed the file to the reserve director, a gruff woman named Lerato. "A man saved him," Sifo said, pointing to the photo. "Majaro's been waiting for him, I know it." Lerato frowned, skeptical. "Lions don't wait, Sifo, they survive." But Sifo pressed, telling her about Thomas's fight to keep Majaro free. The bond that had formed. Lerato listened, her expression softening. She'd seen strange things in her years with animals. Grief in elephants, loyalty in wolves. Maybe Sifo was onto something. Sifo tracked down the sanctuary's old records, found a contact for Thomas A. Call to the village hospital confirmed the worst. Thomas was dying. Sifo sat by Majaro's enclosure that night, the lion's eyes glinting in the moonlight. "You know he's out there, don't you?" Sifo whispered. Majaro didn't move, but his tail flicked once as if in agreement. The next morning, Sifo made his case to Lerato. "Let me take him to Thomas, just once. If I'm wrong, we bring him back. But if I'm right..." He trailed off. Lerato rubbed her temples. weighing the risks. A lion transport wasn't cheap, and the logistics were a nightmare. But something in Sifo's voice, his certainty, swayed her. "One trip," she said finally. "Don't make me regret this." Sifo grinned, already planning. He didn't know if Majaro could really remember, but he believed in the possibility. In a world of fences and rules, sometimes you had to trust the impossible. Majaro was waiting, and Sifo was going to help him find what he'd been searching for. The trailer rumbled across the plains, its reinforced walls vibrating with the hum of the engine. Inside, Majaro lay calm, his massive body curled against the padded floor. Sifo sat in the cab, his hands gripping the wheel, his heart racing with a mix of hope and doubt. The reserve director had given him 3 days, enough time to reach the hospital, let Majaro see Thomas, and return. Don't expect miracles, Lerato had warned, but Sifo wasn't so sure. The journey was 800 miles straight. Shot through dusty towns and endless grasslands, the trailer was a fortress. Steel bars, reinforced glass slits, and a ventilation system to keep Majaro comfortable. Sifo had 2 rangers with him, both skeptical. He won't even know the man. And muttered, checking the tranquilizer gun. Sifo ignored him. He'd seen Majaro's eyes, the way they fixed on the horizon. That lion knew something. At rest stops, people gathered, drawn by the sight of the trailer. "Is that a lion?" a boy asked. Peering through the glass, Sifo nodded, keeping his answers short. He didn't want attention, didn't want the media catching wind. This wasn't about fame, it was about a promise, Thomas's promise to find Majaro, and Majaro's unspoken vow to return. At night, Sifo parked the trailer under starlit skies, checking on Majaro through the slits. The lion was alert, his eyes catching the moonlight. He didn't pace or growl, just watched, as if he understood the journey's purpose. Sifo whispered to him, "We're almost there, big guy, hold on." He didn't know if Majaro heard, but it felt right to say it. The hospital was a small concrete building on the edge of a dusty town. Sifo had called ahead, warning Maria about the plan. She'd laughed, at first thinking it was a joke, then gone silent when she realized he was serious. "You're bringing a lion here?" She'd said, "For Thomas?" Sifo had nodded, his voice steady. "He deserves this." As the trailer crossed the final stretch, Sifo felt the weight of what he was doing. If he was wrong, he'd look like a fool. If he was right, he'd witness something no one would believe. Either way, he was committed. Majaro shifted in the trailer, letting out a low huff. Sifo smiled. "You know, don't you?" he said. The lion's eyes met his through the slit, and for a moment Sifo felt it too, the pull of something bigger than logic, bigger than reason. The truck rolled on, carrying a lion toward a man and a story toward its end. The hospital parking lot was chaos. Word had spread, first through the village, then beyond. A lion was coming. People crowded the gates. Phones raised their voices, a hum of excitement and fear. Nurses peered from windows, patients shuffled to the edges. Of their rooms, Maria stood at the entrance, her arms crossed, her heart pounding. She'd seen a lot in her years as a nurse, but this was madness. Sifo's trailer pulled in just after noon, the sun high and unforgiving. The crowd parted, murmuring. He stepped out, his face calm but resolute. "Stay back," he told the onlookers, his voice carrying authority. The 2 rangers flanked the trailer, their hands on their radios ready for trouble. Sifo opened the trailer's gate and Majaro stepped out. Gasps rippled through the crowd. The lion was enormous, his mane a dark halo, his eyes scanning the scene with a quiet intensity. A woman screamed, and others backed away. But Majaro didn't flinch. He sniffed the air, his nostrils flaring, then took a slow step forward. Sifo held up a hand, signaling the rangers to stand down. "Let him move," he said. Inside, Maria wheeled Thomas to the courtyard, a small patch of grass surrounded by low walls. He was frail, his skin pale, his breathing shallow. "What's all the noise?" he muttered, his voice barely audible. Maria didn't answer. She wasn't sure she could. She pushed the wheelchair through the doors, her hands trembling. The crowd fell silent as Majaro entered the courtyard. He moved, with purpose, his paws silent on the grass. Thomas looked up, his eyes widening. For a moment he didn't breathe. "Majaro!" he whispered, his voice breaking. The lion stopped a few feet away. His gaze locked on Thomas. The air felt heavy, charged, with something no one could name. People held their breath. Cameras rolled, capturing every second. Majaro took another step, then another, closing the distance. A ranger raised his tranquilizer gun, but Sifo waved him off. "He's fine," Sifo said, his voice low. Maria gripped the wheelchair, her knuckles white. Thomas leaned forward, his hands shaking. "You came back," he said, tears streaming down his face. Majaro stopped, his massive body still. He let out a low huff, his eyes never leaving Thomas. The crowd watched frozen as a lion and a man faced each other, separated by years, but bound by something stronger. It wasn't just a reunion, it was a reckoning, a moment that rewrote what anyone thought possible. The courtyard was a bubble of silence, the world holding its breath. Thomas sat in his wheelchair, his frail body trembling with emotion. Majaro stood before him, a wall of muscle and fur, yet gentle in a way that defied his size. The lion's eyes, those same amber eyes from the roadside cage, held Thomas's gaze, unblinking, full of recognition. Thomas reached out, his hand shaking as if to touch the air between them. "You remember me, don't you?" he whispered. Majaro let out a deep exhale, his breath warm and steady. Then slowly, deliberately, he lowered his massive body to the ground, his head bowing until his mane brushed the grass. A collective gasp rose from the crowd. Maria covered her mouth, tears in her eyes. Sifo stood frozen, his heart swelling. No one moved. No one spoke. The lion's bow wasn't submission. It was reverence, a gesture so raw it felt ancient. Thomas sobbed, his voice barely audible. "You came back." The words carried everything. Years of loss, of promises kept, of a bond that had survived time and distance. Majaro stayed low, his eyes never leaving Thomas, as if saying, "I never forgot." The moment stretched eternal and fragile. Nurses wept, their clipboards forgotten. The crowd, now 100 strong, stood in awe. Phones captured every second, but no video could hold the weight of what was happening. Science had no explanation for this animal. Behaviorists would argue later, citing instinct or coincidence, but those in the courtyard knew better. This was love, pure and impossible. Sifo stepped closer, his voice soft. "He knew where to find you, Thomas." Thomas nodded, too weak to say more. Maria knelt beside him, her hand on his shoulder. "I believe you now," she whispered. Thomas smiled, his eyes bright, despite the pain. For the first time in months he felt whole. Majaro rose slowly, his movements careful, as if not to startle the fragile man before him. He stepped closer, close enough that Thomas could feel the heat of his breath. The rangers tensed, but Sifo shook his head. "Let them be." Majaro stopped, his nose inches from Thomas's hand. For a moment they were the only two in the world, a man and a lion, bound by a single act of kindness years ago. The crowd began to murmur, the spell breaking. Sifo signaled the rangers to guide Majaro back to the trailer, but the lion moved willingly, his purpose fulfilled. Thomas watched him go, his tears falling freely. "Thank you," he said, his voice carrying across the courtyard. Majaro paused at the trailer's gate, looking back one last time. His eyes said everything. Thomas's room was quiet, the only sound the soft beep of the monitor. He lay in bed, his breathing shallow but calm. Outside his window, Majaro lay on the grass, his massive body a shadow in the moonlight. The hospital had allowed the lion to stay just for one night in a secured area of the courtyard. No one argued, not after what they'd seen. Thomas smiled, his eyes half closed. Maria sat beside him, holding his hand. Tell me about him. Again, she said, her voice gentle. Thomas's voice was weak, but it carried a warmth she hadn't heard before. He spoke of the cage, the lock, the way Mayaro had looked at him. He spoke of the sanctuary, the fight to keep him free. And he spoke of today, of a lion who'd crossed a continent to say goodbye. I didn't think he'd come, Thomas said, his eyes drifting to the window. But he did. Maria nodded, her throat tight. She'd seen it. The bow, the recognition, the love. She'd never doubt Thomas's story again. As the night deepened, Thomas grew quieter. He whispered stories of the veldt of sunsets and roars of a lion who'd given him purpose. Mayaro stayed outside, his eyes fixed on the window. At one point, he let out a low growl, not aggressive, but mournful, a sound that seemed to carry across the plains. Maria shivered. He knows, she said. Thomas's breathing slowed. He looked at Maria, his eyes clear. He gave me more than I gave him, he said then with a final smile. He closed his eyes. The monitor flatlined, a soft wail cutting through the silence. Maria bowed her head, tears falling outside. Mayaro rose, his head lifting to the sky. He let out a single deep roar, a sound that shook the hospital, echoing across the town. The staff stood still, listening. The crowd outside, smaller now, but still present, fell silent. Majaro's roar wasn't grief alone. It was a farewell, a promise kept. Thomas was gone, but the lion's vigil had given him peace. In his final moments, Maria wiped her eyes, looking out at Majaro. "You did good, big guy," she whispered. Majaro returned to the reserve, the trailers hum a familiar rhythm. Sifo drove in silence, his heart heavy but full. The story of Thomas and Majaro had spread first through the village, then across the world. News outlets ran headlines. Lion travels 800 miles to say goodbye. Videos of the courtyard moment went viral, shared millions of times. People debated. Some called it a miracle, others a fluke, but those who'd been there knew the truth. Back at the reserve, Majaro was different. The restlessness was gone. He no longer paced the fence at dusk. Instead, he'd sit on a low hill facing west, watching the sunset. Sifo watched him, a lump in his throat. "You kept your promise," he said one evening. Leaning against the fence, Majaro's tail flicked as if in acknowledgement. The world changed because of Thomas and Majaro. Wildlife laws tightened, loopholes closed, sanctuaries received more funding, inspired by a story that proved animals could feel, could remember. A local artist sculpted a statue for the reserve. A man kneeling beside a lion, their heads bowed toward each other. It became a pilgrimage site, drawing visitors. From across the globe, Sifo kept Thomas's photo in the reserve's office, a reminder of what he'd witnessed. Maria visited, once bringing a small plaque with Thomas's words, "He gave me more than I gave him." She and Sifo stood by Majaro's enclosure, watching the lion watch the horizon. "He's still with him," Maria said. Sifo nodded. "Always will be." Mayaro lived out his days in peace, his mane greying, but his spirit unbroken. Each evening he'd sit on his hill facing west, where Thomas had last been. The world moved on, but the lion kept his promise. A silent vigil for a man who'd unlocked a cage and set free more than just a lion. Their story lived on, a testament to loyalty, to memory, to a bond that defied everything. We thought we knew.